This is the case of Joseph Douglas Ball, commonly known as the Alligator Man or Alligator Joe. He was known by several other nicknames such as the Bluebeard of South Texas and the Butcher of Elmendorf. A sad twist of fate which became the inspiration for the movie Eaten Alive by Toby Hopper. This was a movie about a deranged hotel keeper in Texas who fed his visitors to alligators hidden away at the back of his property. So just why did he have so many aliases? I guess it's already in the name. Well, let's delve in. Frank Ball, a very wealthy rich man, who lived in Texas in the late 1800s. He is seen as one of the founding fathers of the city of Elmendorf. Elmendorf is a region located nearer to the outskirts southeast of San Antonio, Texas, USA. He made his money in agriculture before Elmendorf was founded. Frank had exploited the growing needs for commerce in his time, and he had built and sold many businesses, including farms. His business acumen and enterprise attracted other businesses to the area, and Frank was a key contributor to the development of the city that would soon come to be known as Elmendorf. As time progressed, Elmendorf became well known for its cotton production and was a major supplier to the county, earning it the name Cotton Country. Frank and his wife Elizabeth had 8 children together, and in 1885, Henry Elmendorf, then mayor of San Antonio, named the small settlement of Big Shar County after himself. Joseph Douglas Ball, or Joe for short, was born 11 years later on the 6th of January 1896. His birth was during a time the nation was going through an economic depression known as the Panic of 1893. More notably, it was a year that marked the end of an era of civil rights movement, which saw a major setback for protesting citizens at the time. It wasn't until 1964, when President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which birthed the beginning of the end of segregation. Anyway, we digress. Joe was the second child to Frank and Elizabeth Ball. The depression of the time wasn't the worst experienced, and after the recession that followed, was the dawn of the First World War. By this time, a young 21-year-old, 6-foot Ball was drafted into the army where he served on the front line with the European allies. Most of Ball's siblings grew up to become upstanding pillars of the community. One of his brothers even became the first mayor of Elmendorf. But the same could not be said for Ball. In his lifetime, he studied at the University of Texas and was married twice. Having served in the army, he was an excellent marksman with a fascination for guns, which doesn't come as a surprise. After serving in the First World War, Joe started a career as a bootlegger. Bootlegging, so-called, was termed during the Georgian era due to persons who were into the practice of concealing liquor or illegal goods in their large boots. Other well-known terms used to describe this activity include rum running and moonshiners. The liquor was made by fermenting a mixture of corn, sugar, and water for several weeks. The resulting liquid, if made well, could have an alcohol content of up to 95%. It was an easy trade to establish. However, this way of manufacturing alcohol had been made illegal in some states, as the prohibition laws were being passed. It was being outlawed due to the rate of crime and socioeconomic problems associated with it, and it soon became illegal across the United States as a whole to make and consume alcohol produced in this way. The citizens were only allowed to make the equivalent of no more than 2 to 3 bottles of alcohol per day for their direct consumption. Bootlegging was a scary activity that often plunged its partakers into the seedy world of violence and crime. One had to be mean to compete and thrive in this dark underworld. And Joe was just that. It's alleged no one wanted to be a debtor to him, and he wasn't a man to be crossed. A lot of people, especially children, were afraid of him. Ball Saloon was situated just outside of Elmendorf, Texas on Highway 181. It was called Sociable Inn. There was music, dancing, gambling, animal fights, you name it. Ball put on quite a hedonistic feast for his guests. He even added an alligator pit, which when he had finished constructing it, obtained some alligators from the nearby swamps and water bodies surrounding them. To arouse the excitement of his paying guests, he would throw smaller animals like puppies and cats into the pit. This was for entertainment. The guests watched the alligators eat as they drank and danced. Unfortunately, but fortunately for Ball, the end of the Prohibition era opened up prospects of a new venture, and he soon upgraded his trade and became the proud owner of a saloon. In the 1920s, saloons was the term for a tavern, the place where people came to drink and socialize. With the aftermath of the World Wars barely behind, these were very hard times. Taverns, or saloons as they were called, were the place where women were able to find work dancing and singing for customers, just to make ends meet. The period of Prohibition began from 1920, a few years after the World War ended, and lasted up to 1933. Sadly, the laws banning the illegal manufacture, sale and consumption of moonshine liquor was widely ignored by the masses, and the law enforcers saw an uncontrollable rise in levels of crime like never seen before. In 1934, Ball had hired a young woman named Minnie Gotthard. Big Minnie, as she was so called due to her stature, was employed as a waitress at the Sociable Inn. In September of 1937, after her relatives hadn't heard from her for a while, they came in search of her. They knew she worked in Texas just outside of Elmendorf, and they came to the inn looking for her. When they approached Ball, he had simply told them Minnie had left and had gotten a job elsewhere. Her relatives, having reached a dead end, decided to report her missing. Another member of Ball's constantly changing staff was a woman by the name of Julia Turner. Just like Minnie, Julia was a waitress at the inn. She had also gone missing. And just like before, when Ball was approached, he had told the same story, that she'd left and sought a job elsewhere. However, her belongings were left intact in the room she shared with a colleague. When asked how she could have left town without any of her personal effects, Ball quickly came up with a response. She'd been in an altercation with her roommate and was anxious to leave, so I gave her $500 for her journey. She took it and left. $500. This is equivalent to approximately $10,000 now. It would have been a large amount of money for a mere innkeeper to part with on a whim in one day. It's not out of the ordinary for people who work closely together to be aware of each other's personal matters. But especially, this information was provided to the deputies who were listening without any reason. So, such a response should have raised anyone's eyebrows in suspicion and provided just cause to probe further. There would be several other women to enter into Ball's employ, another of whom was Dolores. Dolores was 15 years his junior, and Ball had taken a liking to her. It's believed she was about 27 years of age when she went missing. During her brief stint at the inn, Dolores had become good friends with another woman, Hazel Brown. This could be because they were of similar age. Dolores, however, didn't get on with Minnie, and this wasn't a secret. In the spring of 1937, Joe had hit Dolores in the face with a bottle, and she was left with a long scar on her face which started at her eye and ran down to her neck. Ball was still in a romantic relationship with Minnie at the time, but it was in the summer of that year when Minnie suddenly disappeared and was never seen again. With Minnie gone, Joe Ball was free to marry his new love interest, Dolores, in the fall. It was known Minnie's disappearing act wasn't a mere coincidence. It was rumored in the backgrounds of the Sociable Inn that Ball had killed Minnie at the beach, and that Ball himself had revealed this to Dolores. Barely 4 months into their marriage, Ball and Dolores were in a ghastly car accident in which she lost her arm. But in the chaos that was to ensue, it was believed at the time that she lost it to her husband's reptilian pets. But as if the debate as to which tale was either fact or fiction were of no importance, 3 months down the line, just like Minnie, she also disappears. Other names continue to pop up on Joe Ball's ever-recycling list of employees, more of whom he's involved intimately with. Some of them include Helen, Stella, Shotzi, and Buddy. At any time, Joe Ball is known to be dating one girl or the other. And as with other former colleagues, many of them would go missing. Stella, a barmaid, was known to have disappeared following an altercation with Joe over Minnie. Another suspected but rather random victim of his murderous spree was a 16-year-old boy who was often seen hanging about the inn. The people of Elmendorf could no longer continue to ignore the many reports of missing friends, family, and loved ones. The law enforcers were now fully aware of the issue about women missing at the inn, and they decided that it was time to get to the bottom of these mysterious disappearances. They began their investigations by digging into the circle and life around Ball, and compiled a list of potential victims. Women close to Ball were at risk of disappearing. The long list included 2 of his wife's girlfriends and numerous waitresses. During the course of their investigation, some actually began to show up alive, but this didn't avert the eyes of the increasingly perturbed sheriffs from probing further. At this time, more than a dozen girls were reported missing, and sadly some were never to be recovered. In the summer of 1938, when the community had noticed that a lot of women close to Ball had gone missing, including his wife's girlfriends and barmaids, their suspicions were aroused. Ball was an eccentric young man who could likely have had a charismatic attitude and appeared very driven. He was an Army veteran and owned his own business, which was thriving, evidenced by his numerous employees, and a very active romantic life. Notwithstanding, the circumstances surrounding Ball were very questionable indeed. Suspicious something was afoul, the local sheriffs approached him to question him in relation to the unresolved missing persons case. Disappearances in the community may not have been so uncommon in those days, especially with many people coming and leaving. Drifters, people in search of work, settlers, and other migrants. People were always coming and leaving. But such a spot wouldn't have been without its cons. Residents who lived close by began to complain of the smells coming from Ball's yard. Ball had kept evidence of his crimes in a barrel on his sister's property. It swarmed with flies, and it was reported to have smelled like death. Some of the deputies were Joe's hunting partners, and being overwhelmed with a number of reports by this time, they asked Ball, who flat outright denied the allegations. The day before the culmination of this terrible event, they went to check things out for themselves. On getting to his sister's property, they found the barrel was gone. Joe's sister, however, had supported the allegation the barrel was indeed left there at some point, and that it surely smelled like something could have been dead inside. It was a mildly warm Saturday, on the 24th of September, in 1938. The sheriffs had gone to the Sociable Inn to pay Ball a visit. Ball saw them arriving at his inn, and must have thought this day had been coming for some time. How did he plan to face it? The sheriff stood in the tavern face to face with the innkeeper and proprietor, Joe Ball. Thoughts racing through his mind, he knew his killing spree was over. He'd been caught. In the state of Texas, the death penalty was indeed his reward. He would be executed by electrocution for his crimes. The deputies asked Ball to peacefully accompany them to San Antonio Station for questioning. Joe replied that he wanted some time to have a beer and then close his store before leaving with them. As friends of the would-be suspect, they saw no harm. What more could he do at this point? So they agreed. Ball fetches himself a beer. He possibly walks across casually to avoid arousing suspicion. As he drinks his beer, he anticipates his next move. The officers are none the wiser. As he drank, he walked over to the bar. No one expected what happened next. He opens the cash register, where he had hidden a gun. He grabs it quickly, but before any of the deputies could react, he pulls the trigger. He shot himself through the heart. Joseph Douglas Ball was dead. He'd escaped the electric chair, and more importantly, he escaped justice. In another twist of fate, no one ever found out what became of his victims, or even why he committed such a horrible, twisted crime. In the aftermath of Ball's death, the sheriff continued to investigate the situation. Upon inspection at the tavern, they found rotting meat inside the alligator's pond. There was a bloody axe found nearby with clumps of hair stuck to its blade. Their guess was as obvious as anyone else. They continued to search the now quiet tavern. Everywhere they looked, they found human remains. In sheer horror, they found 2 graves. There was a barrel, possibly the same one that was reported to have been situated at his sister's premises, or a different barrel entirely. It also emerged he had not been acting alone. Or to put it a different way, he had a helper, a man by the name of Clifford Wheeler. Clifford came forward willingly, knowing his boss was now no more. He decided of his own volition to confess to the authorities and tell them all he knew about the murders. Wheeler was an African American hired by Ball to work as a handyman. He worked for Ball for nearly 13 years, up until Ball's demise. Wheeler lived in fear of his master, who was cruel to him, as would be expected in the early 1900s when racial segregation was still legal. It was known Ball would often shoot at Clifton's feet and laugh whilst poor Clifton jumped as if dancing to avoid the bullets from striking his foot. Clifton lived in sheer terror of Ball, and in some way, it looks like he could have helped Ball in fear of his life. Given that time in history, Clifton as a black American probably didn't have many other options. It was known that Ball was very mean to the African Americans who worked for him. Among his many ad hoc duties was assisting with the disposal of the bodies of Ball's victims. He led the sheriff to the remains of Minnie Gotthard and Hazel Brown. He confirmed to the deputies that Ball's victims were in excess of 20, but he also reveals, not to their surprise, why they weren't going to find any evidence of this. This was because the alligators had eaten the bodies and that he had helped feed them to the reptilian creatures. Wheeler informed the sheriff that Hazel had met someone else and wanted out of the relationship with Ball, but Ball had refused. So she threatened to go to the police with what she knew about Minnie. For this reason, Ball killed her. It's believed her body had at some time been stored in a barrel. Wheeler recalled how he drove under Ball's instructions to pick up a barrel, and after which, he drove to the outskirts of town with it. After driving for a while, Clifton stopped under Ball's instructions. When they stopped, Ball ordered Clifton to dig a grave at gunpoint. Hazel's body was taken out of the barrel. Ball then handed Clifton a saw and instructed him to saw off the corpse's head, which he refused to do, so Ball did the gory task himself. The headless body was put into the freshly dug grave and was buried. Her head was thrown into a nearby campfire they probably lit earlier that same night. This is the same spot the officers find a jawbone, some teeth, and finally some pieces of a skull. When the officers visit this same place due to Clifton's testimony, they search for Hazel's remains. Her grave was dug up in the full glare of the public, who ran amok at the sight and smell of the decomposing remains.
Wheeler also confessed to being the driver on the night of Minnie's disappearance. He had driven the couple down to Corpus Christi Beach that evening, and after having fun, Ball shot her in the head. Ball told a stunned Wheeler she was having his baby. He wanted to be with Dolores at the time. They buried Minnie at the beach. Could this have been one of his motives? He didn't want to be a father. Or he didn't find any of the barmaids suitable as mothers? He had the perfect tem. Oh, he had a secret to be kept. A secret he didn't want getting out. On the 26th of September in 1938, the police went to Corpus Christi and dug up the shores of the beach. This took some time, but eventually, 18 days later, Minnie's body was found. Wheeler led them to a collection of photographs, showing numerous women who had been reported missing, and were never seen again. A barmaid named Buddy also went missing, but was later found living in San Diego with relatives. Shotzi, a colleague who didn't know Buddy was in San Diego, accused Ball of killing her buddy the same way he killed Minnie. Shotzi taunted Ball until he lost his temper, and hit her with his gun. He hit her so hard it killed her. At the end of his shocking testimony, Wheeler, for his cooperation, received a much lighter sentence of 2 years, for accessory to murder. As for the alligators, they were captured and placed in a zoo. Joe Douglas Ball wasn't by far America's first serial killer, or worst. But he's certainly one of the first few who thought of a unique way to get rid of their victims' bodies. I wonder if this was always his intention when he first created the alligator bond. Some sources would dispute, due to a proportional lack of evidence likely facilitated by his reptilian pets, that Ball ever committed any murders. But if he was innocent, why did he immediately take his life before he could be questioned? If Ball had 5 years to maim more than 20 people, it's an unusual pattern in comparison with most serial killers, in that he seemingly had an early childhood free of the hallmarks of a troubled soul. He is by far unlike most serial killers, with the reasons for their unusual desires and their mode of operation being embedded in their troubled past. However, it's not unheard of. Could Ball only have been in search of a means of living, in an economy faced with hardships, and things went too far too quickly? This may appear unlikely. The primary reason for establishing the inn, being a descendant of one of the most affluent families in Elmendorf. Alarm bells were screaming, but, with very few laws in place, could it be that no one, not even Bo, was aware of the dangers of the choices he made? Is it possible he thought of feeding human flesh to the alligators to keep them as part of his business when finding pets was becoming scarce? Or did things get out of hand with someone close, and the only way to hide the evidence was by feeding the body to the alligators, consequently leading to subsequent murders to stop his secret from getting out? Perhaps someone knew too much? Or did he just lose control and kill at will? Sadly, we'll never know the true motive behind these gruesome murders, but by all accounts, he was truly a narcissistic sadist. He didn't drift far away from home, so I believe he remained in close contact with his family. Why did his crimes go unnoticed until it was too late? Thankfully today, there are laws in place governing the keeping of animals for domestic and commercial purposes, and it doesn't take a dozen people to go missing before the police embark on a search for missing persons. Some might still be asking, why Bluebeard? Well, ironically, Bluebeard was the fictional character of a 16th to 17th century fairy tale. He was said to have had a secret chamber where he kept the bodies of his previous wives. Ball was nicknamed Bluebeard, as most of his victims were former wives and girlfriends.